One of the most powerful features of a Coding Rooms course is the Coding Rooms IDE, which is embeddable on any page in your Coding Rooms course. Students can write and run code in over 50 different languages. And you can even use professional grade IDEs like Visual Studio Code, Jupyter Notebook, RStudio, and more. So how do you add the Coding Rooms IDE to a page and use the Coding Rooms IDE? It's as simple as adding any other block to the page. Either use our / command or the plus icon, and you can add a Coding Rooms IDE. After that, you can choose from one of our pre-configured images, so you can select the appropriate programming language or setup that you need for your course. Let's say, for example, we wanted to use Python 3. It adds this IDE to our page that we can use with learners. What we're setting up here first is the template. This is what the students will get when they first open the page and first start working in the IDE. You can modify the file that you're given here as boilerplate, a simple Hello World program we give you to start off with. You can upload your own files, you can add folders, and you can create other files for you to work with and have your students start off with when they first open up the page and you publish it to them. As you're designing the template, you can run whatever you provide to make sure it's working properly, or you can use this environment to test out certain things that your students may be creating. What's wonderful about the Coding Rooms IDE is once you start it up, you can open up the desktop. And if your students develop anything that's graphical or a desktop application, you can see it right here on the Linux desktop. It's a full Linux desktop where we have a file manager set up for you, and you can also open the terminal here to run commands. We also have audio available where if they were creating something, let's say since we have Python open with Pygame, and they were making a game with audio capabilities, they could actually hear the audio from the game running on the desktop. You can also configure things like the default file that opens for students and that the base run button will use, as well as you can configure that run button to do a custom command, maybe a script that you create yourself, or if you wanted to do anything different, maybe to abstract running or compiling a larger project. If you need to change the language that you've selected to a different setup, you can always do that on the fly. And students can do this also. You can just go over to the settings and change it to a different setup. Another wonderful thing about the Coding Rooms IDE is we track every keystroke a user types. So you can always go back into the playback history and you can see keystroke for keystroke, who typed what. Of course, maybe this isn't as useful for you in the template, but it's certainly useful once you assign the IDE to students and have them start working. The Coding Rooms IDE is collaborative, so you can set up group assignments for your students to work in the IDE together. You can actually track who typed what and how many lines or characters a certain student typed versus another student. You can also see when they create files and delete files in the IDE. We track all of that in the playback history for you to review in your own IDE work as well as your students. We also have this test bench tab here for you to create automated tests with the number of test cases we have, and another video in this series we're going to review in more detail these different test cases. And then you can also create a model solution. And the model solution allows you to store the model or the correct answer, however you want to think of it, for the challenge that you've given your students. This is really great for running the automated tests you build against your model that you create, because of course you want all your tests to pass against your model solution. At the time of this video, we haven't yet released the ability for you to show the model solution to students. However, that is coming very soon, so be on the lookout. The Coding Rooms IDE is very powerful, yet simple enough to use. Again, we support other professional-grade IDEs in a number of different setups that you can use right here in Coding Rooms on your page. Let me give a preview of some of those. For instance, if we add a Coding Rooms IDE, you'll notice that there are this VSC option next to a number of the programming languages. This allows us to open up Visual Studio Code. And so we can actually launch by default Visual Studio Code, and our students can write and run in this setup. Some advantages to having Visual Studio Code or using Visual Studio Code for your course is there's a GUI GitHub setup for students to push and pull from GitHub. And of course, Visual Studio Code has a full debugger, which you can take advantage of if that's something you'd like to cover. If you're familiar with Visual Studio Code, you may also know about a number of the different extensions that are available that you can add and take advantage of with your students. And because Visual Studio Code allows you to set up and modify settings at a workspace level, and it creates a JSON file for you to be able to work with, you can modify and customize VS Code, save that JSON file at the template, and it will automatically transfer when your students first open it up, using those particular extensions, changing the font size, changing whatever you may have modified for them. And yes, the desktop is still available even when you develop with Visual Studio Code, so students can develop desktop applications. Now, using these other IDEs, you also lose some features that are specific in Coding Rooms IDE. For instance, the playback history. But they're never truly gone, because each one of our other IDE setups is always backed by the Coding Rooms IDE. So you can always switch with one click back into the Coding Rooms IDE and still use the playback history, because the files still sync through that, and we still will see all of the edits, all of the history in this playback. One more option for you to see are programs like BlueJ and Greenfoot, which we run on the desktop. If I open up Greenfoot, for instance, you'll notice that we actually show this desktop application on the Linux desktop for you to work with your students. The Coding Rooms IDE has a number of different capabilities, and we try to bring you the software that you need for your classroom right in the web browser, embedded on a learning page for you to use on any device, including iPads and Chromebooks, powerful Macs, powerful Windows machines, or the cheapest of those. As long as you have a web browser, you can access Coding Rooms and your students can code in our environment. And that's the power of Coding Rooms.